The beloved teacher everyone trusted was fired, and the whole town destroyed her until they found her suicide note. I was standing in Ms. Hartley's empty classroom when I found the USB drive taped under her desk drawer, 3 days after they'd discovered her body in her apartment. The room still smelled like the lavender hand lotion she always used, and the chalk dust that never quite settled. Her bulletin boards were bare, stripped by the administration the same day they'd fired her. The motivational posters were gone. The student artwork she'd displayed so proudly had been torn down and discarded. Even her name had been scraped off the door with what looked like a putty knife, leaving only ghostly adhesive residue where Ms. Claire Hartley, English Literature, had been mounted for 8 years. I wasn't supposed to be there. The school was closed for winter break, and technically I was trespassing, but I'd kept my senior class president keycard because no one had thought to deactivate it after graduation 6 months ago. I'd come back to Millbrook High because I couldn't stop thinking about Ms. Hartley, about the last time I'd seen her walking to her car with a box of her belongings, moving like someone who'd been hollowed out from the inside. I'd been one of Ms. Hartley's students for 2 years, sophomore and junior English, and she'd been the kind of teacher who actually changed lives instead of just claiming to in yearbook dedications. She was 34 when everything fell apart, which seemed impossibly young to me at the time, though now at 19 I'm starting to understand how little 34 actually is. She had this way of making literature feel urgent and personal, like the books we read weren't artifacts from dead people, but conversations with friends who understood exactly what it felt like to be confused and angry and desperately searching for meaning. She'd stayed after school countless times to help me with college essays, written recommendation letters that apparently made admissions officers cry according to the counselor at State, and convinced me that maybe I wasn't stupid just because calculus made my brain feel like it was melting. She'd done that for dozens of students over the years. Hundreds, probably. The kind of teacher parents requested specifically, who won awards from the state education department, who had former students come back years later just to say thank you. When I heard what she was accused of, my first instinct was to laugh because it was so absurd, so completely opposite to everything I knew about her. Then I saw people's faces and realized they believed it. That's when the laughing stopped. The accusation came in October, about 2 months into the fall semester. I was home from college for a long weekend when my younger brother Ethan mentioned it casually over dinner, the way teenagers mention catastrophic news like it's just another piece of gossip. "Did you hear Miss Hartley got suspended? Apparently she had an inappropriate relationship with a student." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "What? That's insane. Who's saying that?" Ethan shrugged, more interested in his phone than the conversation. "Some junior. I don't know all the details, but it's all over social media. People are saying she, groomed him or whatever. It's pretty messed up." My mother made a disapproving sound. "I always thought she was a bit too friendly with students. Remember how she'd hug them goodbye on the last day of school? Always seemed inappropriate to me." I stared at my mother, trying to process what I was hearing. "Mom, she hugged students because she cared about them. That doesn't mean she was a predator." "Where there's smoke, there's fire," my mother said, using the phrase that would become Millbrook's unofficial motto over the next few weeks. "These things don't come from nowhere, Connor. That poor boy must have been so confused and scared." I pulled up social media, on my phone, and felt my stomach drop. The Millbrook Community Facebook group, which normally discussed zoning variances and lost pets, had exploded with posts about Ms. Hartley. Parents were expressing shock and betrayal. Former students were re-examining their memories of her, finding sinister meaning in moments that had seemed innocent at the time. Someone had started a petition demanding her immediate termination. It already had 800 signatures. The student who'd made the accusation was named Jeremy Vance. I knew him vaguely, a junior who'd been in my brother's friend group before I left for college. Quiet kid, decent grades, played JV soccer. According to the posts I could find, Jeremy had reported to the school counselor that Ms. Hartley had been sending him inappropriate text messages for months, had invited him to her apartment several times, and had initiated sexual contact on at least 3 occasions. The details were vague in the public posts, protected by privacy laws, but the outline was clear enough. The school board had placed Ms. Hartley on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The police were involved. People were calling her a monster. I tried calling Ms. Hartley's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message saying I didn't believe the accusations, that I was here if she needed anything, that I knew this was a mistake that would get cleared up. I tried to sound confident, but my voice shook because I was already seeing how this would play out. In a small town like Millbrook, population 12,000, accusations like this didn't need proof. They just needed to be spoken out loud. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from my college apartment 3 hours away as Millbrook tore Ms. Hartley apart. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, "Beloved teacher accused of abuse." The article was careful with legal language, using words like alleged and accused, but the damage was done. Her photo ran, alongside the headline, a picture from the school website where she was smiling at the camera, and now that smile looked predatory instead of warm. People I'd grown up with, people who'd loved Ms. Hartley's classes, posted on social media about how they'd always felt uncomfortable around her, how she'd crossed boundaries they hadn't recognized at the time. These retrospective violations multiplied daily. She'd kept students after class too often. She'd been too interested in their personal lives. She'd touched their shoulders when leaning over to look at their work. Every normal teacher behavior was recontextualized as grooming. The investigation moved with surprising speed for something that should have been handled carefully. Within 3 weeks, the school board held an emergency meeting and voted to terminate Ms. Hartley's employment, effective immediately. The board president, a man named Douglas Finch, who owned the largest car dealership in the county, made a statement to the press. The safety of our students is our highest priority. While we cannot discuss the specifics of personnel matters, the evidence presented to this board was sufficiently disturbing to warrant immediate action. We have a zero-tolerance policy for any behavior that endangers our children. Evidence. What evidence? I called the school board office and asked what proof they had, what investigation had been conducted. The secretary told me that personnel matters were confidential and hung up. I called the police department and asked to speak with the detective handling the case. I was transferred to Detective James Kowalski, 15 years with the department, who informed me that the investigation was ongoing and he couldn't discuss details with someone who wasn't directly involved. But I was her student, I said. I know her. This doesn't make sense. What proof do you have? Son, I understand you want to defend your teacher, Kowalski said, his voice patient but firm. But sometimes, the people we think we know have sides we never see. The victim in this case has provided detailed testimony. We're taking this very seriously. Victim. Jeremy was the victim. Ms. Hartley was the predator. That's how the narrative was established, and no amount of defending her would change it. I learned that quickly when I posted on Facebook that I believed Ms. Hartley was innocent, that we should wait for actual evidence before destroying someone's life. The responses came fast and vicious. How dare I defend a child abuser? Was I really prioritizing a predator over a traumatized student? Did I not understand how hard it was for victims to come forward? Several people suggested I must have been groomed too and didn't recognize it. My mother called and asked me to delete the post because I was embarrassing the family. I deleted it. Another act of cowardice I'd add to the list. Ms. Hartley's life disintegrated in ways that would have seemed theatrical if I hadn't watched them happen in real time. Her landlord evicted her, citing a morality clause in her lease. The gym where she'd been a member for 6 years revoked her membership. Someone threw a brick through her car window while it was parked outside the grocery store. The local coffee shop she'd gone to every morning before school put up a sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," and asked her to leave when she came in. She'd been excommunicated from the only community she'd known, cast out like a disease. I drove home from college one weekend in November specifically to try to see her, to offer support, to understand what was happening. I found her address through a mutual acquaintance and showed up at her apartment on a Saturday afternoon. She answered the door looking like she'd aged 10 years in a month. Her hair, which she'd always worn in a neat bun, hung limp around her face. She'd lost weight, enough that her clothes hung loose. Her eyes were red-rimmed and empty. "Connor," she said, and her voice was hoarse like she'd been crying for weeks. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone sees you—" "I don't care," I said, though we both knew that was a lie. "Ms. Hartley, I know you didn't do this. Everyone who actually knows you didn't do this. We just need to prove it." She laughed, a bitter sound that made my chest hurt. "Prove it how, Connor? The system doesn't work that way. I'm supposed to prove a negative, prove that something didn't happen. How do I prove I never sent inappropriate texts when the texts don't exist? How do I prove I never invited him to my apartment when it's his word against mine? How do I prove I never touched him when there's no physical evidence because nothing ever happened?" "There has to be something," I said. "Phone records, witnesses, something that shows you weren't where he says you were when he says it happened." Ms. Hartley shook her head. "I've been over all of this with my lawyer. Jeremy's statements are deliberately vague about dates and times. He says things happened over the summer or after school one day in September. Nothing specific enough that I can provide an alibi. And my phone records just show I have a cell phone that I use normally. That doesn't prove anything except that I didn't text him, but his story is that I made him delete the messages immediately, so the lack of evidence actually supports his narrative." She sat down on her couch like standing was too exhausting. "The lawyer says the school board doesn't need proof beyond reasonable doubt to fire me. They just need to believe it's more likely than not that something inappropriate happened. They believed Jeremy because victims need to be believed. I get that. I've spent my career teaching students to speak up about abuse. But Connor, I'm innocent. I'm completely innocent. And it doesn't matter. No one will ever believe me, because believing me means accepting that a 17-year-old boy lied, and we're not supposed to doubt victims." I sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon, listening to her explain the legal nightmare she was trapped in. Her lawyer, a criminal defense attorney named Patricia Eng, with 23 years of experience, had told her the police investigation was focusing on whether to bring criminal charges. If charged, Ms. Hartley would face trial on charges of sexual assault of a minor and abuse of authority. Even if she wasn't charged criminally, she'd already lost her job, her teaching license was under review by the state, and her reputation was destroyed beyond repair. "Why would Jeremy do this?" I asked. "You barely knew him, right? He wasn't even in your class this year." "He was in my English class last year," Ms. Hartley said. "He struggled with the coursework, Ended up with a C+ for the year. His parents were upset about the grade affecting his GPA. They came in for a conference and demanded I change it to a B. I refused because he hadn't earned it. They went to Principal Vance about it. I felt something click into place. Wait, Principal Vance? Is that Jeremy's father? She nodded. Jeffrey Vance has been principal at Millbrook High for 4 years. He and I have had professional disagreements. Nothing major, just different philosophies about education. He wants metrics and test scores. I want students to actually learn to think critically. He's been pushing for my department to use more standardized curriculum. I've been pushing back. So his son accuses you of abuse right after you refused to change his grade? I said. That's not a coincidence. That's revenge. That's what my lawyer suggested, Ms. Hartley said. But proving it is impossible. Jeremy's story is too detailed to dismiss as simple fabrication. He knows things about my life, about my apartment, about my routines. His testimony includes specific details that make it seem credible. What kind of details? I asked. She looked uncomfortable. He described my apartment accurately. The layout, the furniture, the books on my shelves. He knew I have a cat named Poe. He knew about the framed print of the Great Gatsby cover I have in my living room. Details someone would know if they'd been in my apartment. But you've never had students over? She shook her head firmly. Never. Not once in 8 years of teaching. But Connor, think about it. Jeremy's father is the principal. He'd have access to my personnel file, which includes my home address. Jeffrey has been to my apartment twice for school functions, once for a department head meeting I hosted 3 years ago, and once when he needed me to sign insurance paperwork and I was home sick. Jeremy could have gotten every detail about my apartment from his father. It made sense, a cruel logical sense, but proving conspiracy between a principal and his son to fabricate abuse allegations seemed impossible. I asked if she'd told her lawyer about this connection. Of course. Patricia says it's a huge conflict of interest for Jeffrey to be involved in any administrative decisions about the case, but he recused himself from the school board meetings. The board made the termination decision without his input, supposedly, and the police investigation is being handled independently. On paper, everything looks proper. But Connor, Jeffrey Vance has been on the school board for a decade. He's close friends with Douglas Finch, the board president. He coaches soccer with Detective Kowalski. This whole town is connected, and they all believe Jeffrey's son over me. The hopelessness in her voice was devastating. I wanted to tell her we'd find a way to prove her innocence, that truth mattered, that justice would prevail. But I was 19 years old with no power, no resources, and no idea how to fight a system that had already decided she was guilty. I left her apartment feeling sick and useless. Over the next few weeks, I tried to investigate on my own. I talked to other former students, asking if anyone else had noticed anything suspicious about Jeremy or Principal Vance. Most people didn't want to talk to me, didn't want to be associated with defending Ms. Hartley. The few who did talk just expressed sympathy, but had no useful information. I found one former student, a girl named Alicia Wu, who'd graduated 2 years ahead of me, who said she remembered Jeremy being angry about his grade in Ms. Hartley's class. He complained constantly about how she graded too hard, how she had it out for him, Alicia said when I called her. But honestly, Connor, lots of students complain about teachers who give them bad grades. That doesn't mean he'd lie about sexual abuse. That's a huge accusation to fake. But what if he's not entirely faking it? I said, thinking out loud. What if his father helped him construct a story using real details about Ms. Hartley's apartment that Jeremy could never have known otherwise? What if this is the principal manipulating his own son to take down a teacher he wanted gone anyway? Alicia was quiet for a moment. That's pretty elaborate conspiracy thinking. I know you care about Ms. Hartley, but maybe you need to consider that you don't know her as well as you think you do. Teachers have private lives. Sometimes those lives are complicated. She was being diplomatic, but I heard what she wasn't saying. Even people who'd loved Ms. Hartley were accepting the narrative. It was easier to believe one teacher had betrayed her position than to believe an entire system was corrupt. I contacted a local journalist, a woman named Rebecca Stein, who covered education issues for the Millbrook Gazette. She'd written several articles about the case, all framed around community shock and the importance of protecting students. I asked if she'd be willing to investigate the connections between Jeremy, Principal Vance, and the timing of the accusation. Rebecca listened politely and then said, Connor, I understand you're defensive of your former teacher. That's natural. But I've been covering this case closely, and I've seen the police reports. Jeremy's testimony is detailed and consistent. He's described a pattern of grooming behavior that matches classic predator patterns. Multiple witnesses have confirmed that Ms. Hartley did keep Jeremy after class on several occasions last year. For academic help, I said. That's literally her job. Yes, but it's also how predators isolate victims, Rebecca said. I'm not saying Ms. Hartley is definitely guilty. That's for the courts to decide. But the evidence suggests this is a credible allegation, and my job is to report on that evidence, not to investigate conspiracy theories about the principal's motivation. She was right, of course. A journalist working for a small-town newspaper didn't have resources to investigate institutional corruption, and even if she did, suggesting the principal had orchestrated a false abuse allegation against a teacher would be a career-ending accusation if she couldn't prove it conclusively. The criminal investigation stretched into December. The police interviewed multiple witnesses, including me. Detective Kowalski brought me into the station and asked questions about Ms. Hartley's teaching methods, her interactions with students, whether I'd ever witnessed inappropriate behavior. I told him Ms. Hartley had been professional and appropriate in every interaction I'd ever seen or experienced. He wrote down my statement and thanked me for my cooperation. "You're a good kid for defending your teacher," he said. "Loyalty is admirable, but sometimes the people we look up to aren't who we think they are. You might want to prepare yourself for that reality." On December 15th, the district attorney's office announced they would not be filing criminal charges against Claire Hartley. The statement explained that while Jeremy's testimony was credible, there was insufficient physical evidence to prosecute beyond reasonable doubt. The DA emphasized that declining to prosecute did not mean the abuse hadn't occurred, just that they couldn't meet the burden of proof required for criminal conviction. This should have been good news. It meant Ms. Hartley wouldn't go to prison. But the announcement sparked outrage rather than relief. Parents protested at the courthouse, carrying signs demanding justice for Jeremy. They called the DA's office a disgrace, accused prosecutors of protecting a predator, organized a recall campaign against the district attorney. The fact that criminal charges weren't filed made almost no difference to public opinion. The school board's termination stood. The state teaching board suspended Ms. Hartley's license pending their own investigation. She was unemployable in education and unemployable in most other fields because a simple Google search of her name brought up dozens of articles describing the abuse allegations. She'd been found guilty in the only court that actually mattered anymore, the court of public reputation. I went home for Christmas break and found Millbrook had elevated Jeremy Vance to hero status. He'd given interviews describing his bravery in coming forward. He'd spoken at a school assembly about recognizing inappropriate behavior from authority figures. He'd started an advocacy group for male survivors of female predators, pointing out that society often dismissed or minimized abuse when the genders didn't match stereotypical patterns. All of this would have been admirable if it had been real, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this story. On December 21st, I drove past Ms. Hartley's apartment and noticed her car wasn't there. I'd driven past a few times since being home, just checking, making sure she was okay. The absence of her car made me nervous. I sat in the parking lot for an hour waiting for her to return. She didn't. I called her cell phone. No answer. I called her lawyer's office and asked if Patricia Eng had heard from her client recently. The receptionist said she couldn't discuss client communications and suggested I contact Ms. Hartley directly if I was concerned. I called the police non-emergency line and asked if I could request a welfare check. The dispatcher asked why I was concerned. "I haven't seen or heard from her in a few days, and she's been going through a really difficult time," I said. "I just want to make sure she's okay." The dispatcher took my information and said they'd send an officer to check on her. I waited in the parking lot. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser arrived. I recognized the officer, a young cop named Trevor Landry, who'd graduated from Millbrook High 3 years before me. He knocked on Ms. Hartley's door. No answer. He knocked again, called out, identified himself. Nothing. He tried the doorknob. Locked. He called for backup. I watched from my car as 3 more officers arrived, as they discussed whether they had cause to enter the apartment. Finally, the building manager showed up with keys. They opened the door. I couldn't see inside from where I was parked, but I watched Officer Landry's body language change. He stepped back from the doorway quickly, spoke urgently into his radio, waved the other officers back. More police arrived. An ambulance. The medical examiner's van. I knew what that meant before anyone told me. Ms. Hartley was dead. I sat in my car with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I watched them bring her body out in a black bag. Just a shape on a gurney, covered and anonymous. I wanted to scream. I wanted to get out of the car and demand they explain what happened, demand they acknowledge what they'd done to her. But I just sat there like a coward while they loaded her body into the van and drove away. Officer Landry approached my car before he left. He tapped on my window and I rolled it down. "You're the one who called for the wellness check?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "She'd been dead for about 3 days, Landry said. "Looks like an overdose. Pills and alcohol. There was a note." "A note? What did it say?" I asked. Landry shook his head. "That's not information I can share. But Connor, I know you cared about her. I'm sorry." He walked back to his cruiser and drove away, leaving me alone in the parking lot with the knowledge that Ms. Hartley had unalived herself, while everyone in Millbrook celebrated her destruction. The town's response to her death was complicated and ugly. Some people expressed genuine sadness, saying they wished she'd gotten help, that mental health support was so important. Others said her unaliving was proof of her guilt, that innocent people don't kill themselves. They said she'd taken the coward's way out to avoid facing Jeremy in court, to avoid accountability for what she'd done. The most vicious comments came on social media, people saying good riddance, saying she'd save taxpayers the cost of a trial, saying the world was better off without predators. I reported every single one of those comments and watched none of them get removed because technically they weren't violating community standards. Stating "you're glad a dead woman can't hurt more children" apparently counts as acceptable discourse. Ms. Hartley's funeral was small. Her parents, who lived in Oregon and looked destroyed, a few cousins, her lawyer, Patricia Eng, 3 former students, including me. That was it. 8 years of teaching, hundreds of students whose lives she'd touched, and 3 of us showed up to her funeral. Everyone else stayed away, either because they believed she was guilty or because they were afraid of being associated with her. The cowardice was breathtaking. I sat in the second row of the nearly empty funeral home chapel and cried for the first time since finding out she was dead. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ugly sobbing that made my whole body shake. I cried for Ms. Hartley, for everything she'd lost, for the fact that she'd died alone, believing no one would ever know the truth. I cried for my own failures, for all the moments I could have done more, said more, fought harder. I cried because the world was so fundamentally broken that something like this could happen, and nobody with power cared enough to stop it. After the service, Patricia Eng approached me. "Connor, right? Claire mentioned you several times, said you were one of the few people who believed her." I nodded, wiping my face with my sleeve. For whatever that was worth, which was apparently nothing. Patricia looked at me with tired eyes. She appreciated it more than you know. In those last few weeks, knowing that even a few people believed in her innocence meant everything. She paused, seemed to be deciding something. "There's something you should know. Claire left several notes. One for her parents, one for me, and one that she specifically said should be given to you if anything happened to her. She gave it to me 2 weeks ago, said if she died, I should make sure you got it." My stomach twisted. She was planning this? "I don't think planning is the right word," Patricia said carefully. "But I think she knew she was reaching the end of what she could endure. She was living in a town where people vandalized her car, where she couldn't go to the grocery store without being harassed, where her entire identity had been destroyed. She'd lost everything that mattered to her. I'm not surprised she couldn't see a way forward." She pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to me. My name was written on the front in Ms. Hartley's neat handwriting. She also gave me specific instructions to give this to the police, to the school board, and to the press if I felt it was appropriate. I've been reviewing it over the last few days trying to decide what to do. After reading what she wrote, I think you should be the one to decide whether it goes public. You knew her. You believed her. I'll trust your judgment on whether sharing her final words will honor her memory or just cause more pain. I took the envelope with shaking hands. "What does it say?" "Read it," Patricia said. "Then call me. We'll talk about what comes next." I waited until I was back in my car, parked in the empty funeral home lot, before I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in Ms. Hartley's careful script. It started with my name. "Connor, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry to put this burden on you, but you're one of the only people who might understand what really happened and might care enough to do something about it. I need someone to know the truth, even if that truth dies with me. I didn't abuse Jeremy Vance. I never touched him inappropriately. I never texted him anything but routine communications about classwork. I never invited him to my apartment. Every single aspect of his accusation is a fabrication, and I can prove it." My hands started shaking so badly I had to rest the letter on the steering wheel to keep reading. "Jeremy's accusation includes details about my apartment that he claims he observed during visits that never happened. He described my living room furniture, my bookshelves, my cat. He knew these things because his father, Principal Jeffrey Vance, had been in my apartment twice for school-related visits. Jeffrey took photos during those visits without my knowledge. I discovered this by accident 6 months ago when I saw his phone sitting on my kitchen counter with a photo of my living room open on the screen. At the time, I thought it was odd but didn't consider it suspicious." The letter continued. "Jeremy's accusation came 3 weeks after I refused to change his grade and 2 weeks after I filed a formal complaint with the school board about Jeffrey's financial irregularities. I discovered that Jeffrey had been using school funds to pay for personal expenses, disguising them as educational, supplies, and professional development. I documented everything and submitted it to Douglas Finch, the board president. Finch is Jeffrey's close friend and apparently warned him about my complaint instead of investigating it. The abuse allegation against me was filed 6 days later. This wasn't coincidence. This was retaliation." My breath caught. She'd had proof. She'd known what they were doing. I couldn't share this information with the police or my lawyer without concrete evidence. Jeffrey is careful. The financial irregularities are subtle enough to explain away as accounting errors. The photos he took of my apartment could be claimed as accidental. I have no recording of Jeremy admitting the accusation was false. All I have is a pattern that suggests conspiracy, and patterns aren't evidence. I would sound paranoid, desperate, like a guilty person grasping at conspiracy theories to avoid accountability. The letter went on. I tried to keep fighting. I believed that truth would eventually win. But Connor, the truth doesn't win when the entire system is designed to protect itself. Jeffrey Vance has been principal for 4 years and friends with the school board for longer. Detective Kowalski coaches soccer with Jeffrey. Douglas Finch goes hunting with Jeffrey every fall. The superintendent, the mayor, the newspaper editor, they're all part of the same social circle that treats Jeffrey as one of their own. I'm an outsider, a woman who never quite fit into Millbrook's social structure. When forced to choose between believing me and believing one of their own, they chose Jeffrey's son. They chose wrong, but they'll never admit it. The third page was shorter. I know what people will say about my death. They'll say I killed myself out of guilt. They'll use my unaliving as proof that I was guilty all along. But Connor, I'm not dying because I'm guilty. I'm dying because I can't live in a world where innocence doesn't matter, where a false accusation is enough to destroy everything you've built, where fighting back makes people more certain of your guilt. I'm tired. I'm so tired of being hated for something I didn't do. The letter ended with instructions. There's a USB drive taped under the right drawer of my classroom desk. I hid it there before the school seized my belongings. The drive contains documentation of Jeffrey's financial fraud, bank statements, receipts, emails, all proving he's been stealing from school funds for at least 3 years. The total is probably close to $90,000. I'd planned to present this evidence to the state education board, but I never got the chance. If you can find that drive and get it to the right authorities, maybe my death won't be completely meaningless. Maybe you can expose what they did. Not for me. I'm past caring about vindication. But for the next teacher who crosses Jeffrey Vance, the next person who doesn't realize how dangerous it is to challenge powerful men in small towns. Please, Connor, don't let them bury the truth with my body. All my love, Claire Hartley. I sat in that parking lot and read the letter 4 more times. Then I called Patricia Eng and told her I was going to get that USB drive. That's how I ended up breaking into Millbrook High at 10 o'clock on a Friday night 3 days after Miss Hartley's funeral. I used my old keycard, praying they still hadn't deactivated it. The light on the reader blinked green. I slipped inside and made my way through dark hallways to Miss Hartley's classroom, using my phone flashlight to navigate. The door was unlocked. The room had been stripped bare, but her desk was still there, too heavy for the custodial staff to move. I crawled underneath and ran my fingers along the underside of the drawers. Nothing on the left side. The right drawer had something taped to the bottom, a small rectangular shape wrapped in layers of duct tape. I peeled it loose and found a USB drive in a plastic bag. I sat on the floor of that empty classroom and cried again, holding this tiny piece of plastic that represented Ms. Hartley's final act of defiance. Then I stood up, pocketed the drive, and left the building. I drove straight to Patricia Eng's house, even though it was almost midnight. She answered the door in a bathrobe, took one look at my face, and invited me inside. I showed her the USB drive and Ms. Hartley's letter. We plugged the drive into her laptop. The files were meticulously organized. Ms. Hartley had been an English teacher, but she'd documented Jeffrey Vance's fraud with the precision of an accountant. Spreadsheets tracking school purchase orders against actual delivered supplies. Photographs of receipts showing Jeffrey had bought furniture for his home using school accounts coded as classroom supplies. Bank statements showing payments from school vendors to Jeffrey's personal account. Email chains where Jeffrey directed the business manager to make payments for services that were never rendered. The scope was staggering. Over 3 years, Jeffrey had stolen approximately $87,000 from Millbrook High. He'd used the money to pay for home renovations, a boat, his son's travel soccer expenses, vacations. He'd been systematic and careful, but Ms. Hartley had been more careful in documenting everything. This is prosecutable, Patricia said, her eyes widening as she clicked through the files. This is embezzlement, fraud, theft from a public institution. With this documentation, the state attorney general would have to investigate. They can't ignore this. But will anyone believe it? I asked. Or will they say Ms. Hartley fabricated everything as revenge for being accused? Patricia thought about that. The bank statements are real. The receipts are real. The email chains can be verified through the school's server records. Jeffrey can claim Claire falsified some of it, but he can't falsify bank records or emails that still exist on institutional servers. This evidence is independently verifiable. That's why Claire was so careful about documentation. She looked at me. Connor, if we go public with this, there will be consequences. The school board will claim we're defaming a dead woman to protect a living one. Jeffrey's supporters will say this is a smear campaign. Jeremy will be caught in the middle of a scandal that might expose his father's crimes, but could also expose his own lie. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Ms. Hartley reading cruel comments on social media. I thought about her sitting alone in her apartment knowing the entire town hated her for something she hadn't done. I thought about her writing these letters, documenting everything, hoping someone would care enough to seek justice even after she was gone. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Let's burn it all down. Patricia contacted the state attorney general's office Monday morning. She submitted Ms. Hartley's letter, the USB drive, and a formal complaint alleging embezzlement and conspiracy to file false charges. The AG's office assigned a special investigator, a woman named Diana Cho, with 18 years of investigating public corruption. Diana moved fast. She subpoenaed bank records, school financial documents, email server logs. She interviewed the school business manager, who confirmed that Jeffrey had directed questionable payments, but had assured her everything was legitimate. She interviewed vendors who'd received school payments and confirmed they'd never provided the services they'd supposedly been paid for. Within 2 weeks, Diana had enough evidence to present to a grand jury. The grand jury indicted Jeffrey Vance on 8 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and theft from a public institution. The indictment made headlines. Millbrook principal indicted on embezzlement charges. The same newspaper that had destroyed Ms. Hartley now reported that Jeffrey Vance had been stealing from the school for years. The same community that had elevated Jeremy to hero status now had to confront that his father was a criminal. But the connection between Jeffrey's crimes and Jeremy's accusation wasn't immediately obvious to the public. That's where I came in. I gave Rebecca Stein, the journalist who'd covered Ms. Hartley's case, an exclusive interview. I showed her Claire's letter, explained the timeline of how the abuse allegation came just days after Ms. Hartley reported Jeffrey's fraud, provided documentation showing that Jeffrey had access to Claire's apartment and could have shared details with Jeremy. Rebecca was skeptical at first. "Connor, you're asking me to publish a story suggesting a teenager lied about sexual abuse. Do you understand how dangerous that is? If you're wrong, we're victimizing an actual survivor. If you're right, we're still making it harder for real victims to be believed in the future." "I know," I said. "But what about Ms. Hartley? She was a victim too. She was victimized by a false accusation, by a corrupt principal, by a system that protected powerful men over vulnerable women. Doesn't she deserve to have her story told?" Rebecca spent 3 weeks investigating. She interviewed former students, reviewed documents, spoke with Diana Cho about the embezzlement case. She tried to interview Jeremy, but the Vance family's lawyer refused to allow it. Finally, Rebecca published a long investigative piece. Questions surround abuse accusation as principal faces fraud charges. The article was careful and measured, presenting the timeline without making definitive claims about Jeremy's truthfulness. But the implications were clear. The community response was fractured. Some people immediately rejected the suggestion that Jeremy had lied, insisting that questioning any abuse allegation was dangerous and harmful. Others started reconsidering, looking at the pattern Rebecca had exposed, wondering if they'd been manipulated. The pressure on Jeremy intensified. Anonymous social media accounts started calling him a liar. People who'd supported him began asking questions. His advocacy group fell apart. Students at school stopped treating him like a hero and started treating him like a question mark. Detective Kowalski, who'd investigated the original accusation, was forced to reopen the case in light of new information. This time, investigators looked at the connections between Jeffrey's crimes and the timing of Jeremy's report. They examined Jeremy's phone records and found deleted text messages between Jeremy and his father discussing the plan and making sure the story is consistent. They interviewed Jeremy again, this time with a child psychologist present, and under gentle questioning, Jeremy began to crack. He admitted his father had coached him, that Jeffrey had told him Ms. Hartley was dangerous and needed to be stopped, that Jeffrey had provided the details about Claire's apartment, that the inappropriate texts had never existed, that Jeremy had felt trapped and scared and had gone along with his father's plan because he was 17 and didn't know how to stand up to his father. The confession destroyed what remained of the original narrative. Jeremy Vance had filed a false police report under his father's direction. Claire Hartley had been innocent all along. The authorities moved quickly once Jeremy confessed. Jeffrey Vance was charged with additional crimes: conspiracy to file a false police report, intimidating a witness, retaliating against a whistleblower. Jeremy, as a minor who'd been manipulated by his father, was offered a plea deal: probation, community service, and mandatory therapy in exchange for testifying against Jeffrey. The trial was held in March. I attended every day, sitting in the courtroom gallery watching Jeffrey Vance try to maintain his dignity, while prosecutor after prosecutor presented evidence of his crimes. The embezzlement case was straightforward. The bank records were damning. Jeffrey's defense was that he'd intended to pay the money back, that these were temporary loans, not theft. The jury didn't buy it. The conspiracy case was more complex. The defense argued that Jeremy had made the accusation independently, that Jeffrey had merely supported his son. But the text messages between them proved otherwise. Messages where Jeffrey told Jeremy exactly what to say. Messages where Jeffrey coached Jeremy on how to describe Claire's apartment. Messages where Jeffrey promised Jeremy everything would be okay, that Ms. Hartley would be gone, and no one would ever know the truth. Jeremy testified against his father. He took the stand looking small and broken, admitted he'd lied about Ms. Hartley, explained how his father had pressured him into making the accusation. The defense tried to paint Jeremy as an unreliable witness, seeking to avoid punishment, but his testimony was too detailed, too damning. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. Jeffrey Vance was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, plus 5 years for conspiracy and witness intimidation, sentences to run consecutively. 16 years total. He'd be 63 when released. His teaching license was revoked. His pension was forfeited. His wife divorced him. Everything he'd built was destroyed, the way he'd destroyed Claire Hartley. The Millbrook School Board issued a formal apology. "We failed Claire Hartley. We allowed a corrupt administrator to manipulate our processes and destroy an innocent educator. We are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure this never happens again." The apology felt hollow. They hadn't failed her. They'd actively participated in destroying her. They'd voted unanimously to terminate her employment. They'd released statements calling the accusations credible. They'd refused to investigate the obvious conflicts of interest. The state teaching board posthumously reinstated Ms. Hartley's license. Her personnel file was amended to show her termination had been unjust. These bureaucratic corrections meant nothing because she was dead, but her parents found some comfort in the official acknowledgement of her innocence. Douglas Finch, the The school board president who'd received Ms. Hartley's initial complaint about Jeffrey's fraud resigned after admitting he'd warned Jeffrey instead of investigating. He faced no criminal charges, but became unemployable in education. Detective Kowalski faced an internal affairs investigation for his handling of the case, but was cleared of wrongdoing. The investigation found he'd followed proper procedures. He'd just been lied to by sophisticated perpetrators. That explanation didn't satisfy me. Kowalski should have investigated the connections between Jeffrey and Jeremy more carefully. He should have questioned why a principal's son was accusing a teacher the principal had conflicts with. But institutional failure rarely results in individual accountability. The community's reckoning was messy and incomplete. Some people offered genuine apologies, acknowledged they'd participated in destroying an innocent woman, tried to understand how they'd been manipulated so easily. Others refused to accept responsibility, claimed they'd been deceived like everyone else, insisted they couldn't have known the truth. Many people who'd posted vicious comments about Ms. Hartley simply deleted their posts and pretended they'd never said anything. The internet's memory is long, though. Screenshots of their cruelty circulated, reminders of how quickly good people become a mob when given permission to hurt someone. I saved every screenshot, every hateful comment, every celebration of Ms. Hartley's termination and death. Not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I needed people to be unable to rewrite history, unable to pretend they hadn't participated. Ms. Hartley's parents established a scholarship in her name for students interested in teaching. They also filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the school district, Jeffrey Vance, and the school board members who'd voted to terminate their daughter. The lawsuit settled for $2.3 million. The money went to the scholarship fund and to organizations supporting falsely accused educators. Jeremy Vance completed his probation and community service. He gave several interviews about being manipulated by his father, about the guilt he'd carry forever for his role in Ms. Hartley's death. Some people accepted his remorse. Others said he was old enough at 17 to know that false accusations destroy lives. I fell somewhere in between. Jeremy had been manipulated by a corrupt father, but he'd also made choices. He'd maintained the lie even as he watched Ms. Hartley's life disintegrate. He'd given interviews as a survivor, accepted praise for his bravery, built an advocacy platform on a lie. His age and his father's manipulation provided context, but they didn't erase the damage. 3 years later, I'm 22 and still processing everything that happened. I changed my major from business to journalism because I couldn't stop thinking about how easily Millbrook had accepted a false narrative. I want to be the kind of journalist who asks uncomfortable questions, who investigates instead of just reporting what authorities claim, who remembers that sometimes the people everyone believes are lying, and sometimes the people everyone hates are innocent. I think about Ms. Hartley constantly, about the letter she left me, about the USB drive she hid, knowing she might not live to see the evidence used, about the fact that she died believing no one would ever know she'd been innocent. That breaks me every time I consider it. She died alone, hated, destroyed by a lie, and she never got to see Jeffrey Vance convicted, or her reputation restored, or the truth finally acknowledged. Patricia Eng and I stay in contact. She's representing 2 other teachers who've been falsely accused, using Ms. Hartley's case as a template for investigating whether accusations might be retaliatory. Most aren't. Most abuse accusations are legitimate and need to be taken seriously. But Patricia says that approximately 2 to 10% of sexual assault accusations are false, and those false accusations destroy lives as thoroughly as real assaults destroy victims. The solution isn't to doubt all victims. The solution is to investigate carefully, to look for evidence, to avoid rushing to judgment while still supporting people who come forward. Millbrook High installed a memorial plaque for Ms. Hartley in the English department hallway. Claire Hartley, beloved teacher, dedicated educator, taken too soon. The plaque doesn't mention how she died or why. It doesn't say she was destroyed by a false accusation and institutional corruption. It just presents her as a loss, sanitized and safe. I hate that plaque. I want one. That tells the truth. Claire Hartley, murdered by a lie. Remember what we did. But the school board would never approve that version because it would require them to admit their guilt instead of hiding behind passive language about tragedy and loss. On the 3-year anniversary of Ms. Hartley's death, I visited her grave. Her parents had chosen a simple headstone, her name, her dates, and a quote from The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. She'd taught that book every year, had students memorize that final passage about the futility of trying to escape history. I stood at her grave and told her we'd found the USB drive, told her Jeffrey was in prison, told her the truth had come out even though she hadn't lived to see it. I told her I was sorry I hadn't done more when she was alive. Sorry I'd posted something supportive on Facebook but had deleted it when people criticized me. Sorry I'd been more worried about my own reputation than about standing with someone who needed allies. I told her I was trying to honor her memory by becoming someone who wouldn't make those mistakes again. Someone who'd ask questions instead of accepting easy narratives. Someone who'd stand with the accused even when it was uncomfortable because sometimes the accused are innocent and everyone else is wrong. I don't know if she would have forgiven me for my cowardice when she needed support. I don't know if she'd be proud of what I'd done after her death, or if she'd think it was too little too late. I just know I carry her with me in every decision I make now, in every story I investigate, in every moment when I'm tempted to stay silent because speaking up is risky. Ms. Hartley taught me that silence is participation, that neutrality in the face of injustice is choosing the side of the oppressor, that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing, and you do it anyway because the alternative is living with the knowledge that you could have helped and chose not to. She taught me those lessons in her classroom when I was 16. She taught me those lessons again through her death when I was 19. I wish she'd lived to see me learn them. I wish I'd been brave enough to apply them when she needed me. But all I can do now is make sure her story isn't forgotten, that the truth about what happened to her stays public, that the next time a town decides to destroy someone based on an accusation, at least a few people remember Claire Hartley and ask questions before joining the mob. That's not redemption. That's not enough. But it's the work I have to do for the rest of my life, because I failed someone who deserved better. Because a good teacher died believing she was alone. Because justice came too late to matter for the person who needed it most. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.